Okay, it's Dr. Hennessy, May 2nd, 2021. This video is an update on the evidence and basis for using masks with COVID-19. I'm doing this because there's so much assumed about the masks, what we know and what we don't know, what was the evidence for it, and the basis for continuing it. So I'm going to go back to, where did we ever get the idea that masks could block COVID-19 infection? And there were studies done that had some impact on that question. But one thing I want to say right from the start is that since the very beginning of the pandemic through this date today, no one anywhere in any place in any way has ever actually measured COVID-19 in anyone's exhaled breath anywhere, much less any infective amount of it. Okay, so what sort of evidence is there for it? And basically it's circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence, I liken it to convicting someone of a crime because they meet the basic description of the suspect. And that's pretty much the level of evidence that we have so far. And what is that evidence? So it kind of started out with, people may remember that when the pandemic started, there wasn't a recommendation for masks. And that is because there was some evidence that coronavirus wasn't transmitted by exhaled breath. There was a study in Hong Kong published in June of 2020 that was based on seasonal coronavirus, and it was a mask study demonstrating the effectiveness of blocking influenza, coronavirus, and rhinovirus by the use of masks. And as part of that study, subjects with documented infections of those three viruses were studied. And the basic summary was that, first of all, unless the person was coughing, there was no coronavirus in their exhaled breath. And these were 30-minute exhaled breath studies. There was actually no influenza virus either, unless they were coughing. But there was rhinovirus. And the other parts of the study showed that masks blocked the transmission of influenza virus and rhinovirus, and coronavirus in those people who were coughing. And in the study, the people who were coughing were the most common, they coughed most when they had coronavirus as opposed to influenza or rhinovirus, which that makes sense. Coronavirus is a coughing virus. So that was the basis that we went into this, which means that Sweden essentially has been following the science the whole time, because that study has never been repeated and shown to be different with COVID-19. Okay, so where did we get this idea that somehow COVID-19 is swirling out in people's breath? That is all indirect evidence. The first indirect evidence were the studies that demonstrated the presence of COVID-19 RNA, that it was said that it was shedding in asymptomatic people. So what does that mean? Doesn't that mean they found it coming out of them? No, not exactly. That's not what they found. The definition of shedding is retrieving the viral RNA from the back of the person's nasopharynx using a swab, sticking it in through your nose, swabbing it against the back of your throat, which anybody who's ever had that done to them knows how invasive that is. No, so that's what the definition of shedding the virus was. The ability to retrieve it on a nasopharyngeal swab, which for most people, that really that's not the common idea of what the word shedding means. shedding means like, but isn't something coming out of it, people? So that was sort of a dishonest term that was being used by scientists. And it was implying that they were proving that it was coming out, but they knew they weren't. They just kind of used that term, and they could defend it saying, well, that's a scientific term that we use for that procedure. But in the common understanding of that term, that's not what it means. And unfortunately, a lot of scientists didn't know that was the definition. So right then, there was a quantum leap to, oh, we proved that the virus is coming out of people and asymptomatic people, but that's not what they proved. They only proved that they could retrieve it from the back of the nasopharynx. And so all of a sudden there was a jump to the next conclusion that, oh, it must be coming out. Oh, okay, so now we had then that was accepted science now, even though no one ever proved it. And in fact, some researchers began to immediately question, what did that mean? Since that wasn't proving that there was anything viable or infectious about the RNA, but they were ignored. They were just kind of waved away as being, a minority opinion or dissent that just really wasn't important. So then later on, even though the CDC had to admit, well, retrieving RNA from the nasopharynx doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything infectious there. So they even changed their recommendations to stop doing swabs to decide when the infection was over, and they put the timeline at 3 months, which probably is at 6 months. That you can still have RNA there, which is also something it's a known phenomenon in virology. It's true for measles. There's other viruses that we've known for a long time. You can still retrieve the RNA long after the infectious period or transmissible period is passed. So it didn't mean anything that it was there. Okay, and so that's finally the CDC. Well, they've admitted that, and so they don't recommend follow-up swabs. And which also calls into question some of the other studies that said reinfection. Well, because what if somebody was, swabbed within 3 months of their first COVID case and they found it again? Oh, reinfection. Well, maybe it wasn't reinfection at all. Maybe it was just still there. Anyway, so this idea of the nasal swabs, or the nasopharyngeal swabs, and the terminology was very loose too in many of these early studies. Some of it, they didn't bother to define how they got the swabs. Some of them just called them nasal swabs, but they were all nasopharyngeal swabs. At any rate, so now we had jumped to the conclusion that because of that, it had to be an exhaled breath. So then they went to work showing how this could work. So laser diffraction studies were being done on people talking loudly, and they could find like aerosols coming out of the people. Okay? Oh, now we've got it. We've got aerosols coming out of the people. That's got to be it. Except they never showed that there was any virus in any of those aerosols. And the same thing with the laser diffraction of how far did these things go out, with mannequin studies of forced microparticles. Yeah, but they weren't COVID-19 microparticles, and bottom line is no one ever proved that there was actually any COVID-19 coming out of anyone's mouth or nose when they were just breathing or talking or singing. Because that's another one, some of the interesting early studies, the choir outbreak in Washington. Oh, that had to do it. There was a super spreader event at a choir practice. That's it. That had to be proof that it had to be caused by the singing, right? But actually, they never showed that. What if it was being caused by foam-like transmission of touching a common object, the back of a chair, a doorknob? And even the CDC's report said that the transmission was either by airborne or fomite transmission. Because back then, because this was an old study, the CDC was still operating under reasonably established scientific principles of not saying more than you know. That once upon a time used to be a scientific principle, that you didn't just jump to a conclusion because it sounded right to you. I can tell you that in my career, I've been corrected numerous times by my teachers for jumping to conclusions. In science, and I know in medicine and in science, you're supposed to think critically. You're not supposed to just accept the first implication that it might be. We've learned this. We've learned it the hard way. Galileo, in the case of Galileo, Copernicus, or whoever it was, that was saying that when they said, well, the Earth was revolving around the sun, which, well, people at those times, they could plainly see that wasn't true. You know, you got up in the morning, you saw the sun rising in the east going overhead, setting in the west. Obviously, the sun was going around the Earth. You could see it. Obvious. That's the thing, one of the scientific principles. Don't jump to a conclusion until you have proof. So, but that's what we've done. And so I was just sitting here waiting and waiting and waiting for someone to do an actual study of exhaled breath. I mean, we've known prevalence of asymptomatic COVID infection by serology studies in populations for a long time. I mean, so let's just say there was a 5% prevalence of asymptomatic COVID in the general population. So if you took 5 people out of 100 should have it in their exhaled breath. 50 out of 1,000 should. What is it? 500 out of 10,000. So, I mean, couldn't you power a study? I mean, they've got these devices. I wrote one down here. Sartorius MD8 air scan sampling device. Good thing. I'm sure there's other ones too. You know, we have these devices. Couldn't some virologist somewhere have, you know, just done they could have done a population study. They could have gone outside Walmart and set up a little booth, and in short order collected 10,000 people. Well, I mean, I don't know. I'm not a statistician. You know, they could have powered the study to be valid. That's what the mathematicians and statisticians do. They can figure out how many people would you have to check, because that's what science does. You have an hypothesis that COVID is coming out of exhaled breath. You construct an experiment. You measure it because you have the ability to, and then you find out, was your hypothesis true or not? But that's not what they did. Instead, they had a conclusion they wanted to arrive at. So they did these other studies, mannequin studies of microparticles. You know, so that's fake science. We talk about fake news, and then fake science turned into fake news. And then everywhere, you got billboards going up, wear a mask, save lives. Whoever proved that? And here, for me, was the real proof that it was all wrong. I mean, I wasn't saying that I wasn't believing that it wasn't true. All I knew is that they hadn't proved it. Then I printed this out. This is a little graph of COVID in the United States. Okay, so looking here, this is the start of the pandemic, and this is probably New York here. And then to August here, west, southwest. But then here's starting November through December, January. All right. Everyone was wearing a mask then. You couldn't get in any store. You couldn't go anywhere without a mask. You couldn't go to church without a mask. You couldn't go anywhere without a mask. Right there. Okay. So I'm looking at that. That's one thing that I and the authorities agree on. We both can come to the same conclusion. Wearing masks didn't work. But they're like, well, maybe they didn't work because maybe it was leaking out the side. Maybe we weren't wearing them right. Or maybe we needed 3 masks. Oh yeah, so then they do the study showing that 3 masks are better than 1 for blocking microparticles. Yeah, that's right, microparticles. That's what we're really interested in, is microparticles. So, but before that, we were told masks were 100% effective. The famous salon study. Yeah, the salon worker A and B, wearing the masks, seeing all of these customers during an infectious period, and no cases transmitted at work, and the customers were wearing masks too. Which, although at the time we were told, well, that wouldn't help you anyway, because obviously it wouldn't help you because it could infect you through the eyes, but was thrown in as a tidbit of pro-mask information that the customers were wearing. Most of the customers wore masks. None of them got infected. Oh. And one of the salon stylists, A, didn't wear. She sometimes wore just a face covering and not a surgical mask. Which later we were told, oh no, face coverings, no, not good, not good. Surgical mask minimum, and then 2 or 3 of them. But at the time, it was like, oh, that's 100% effective. But how did we know that okay, let's just say, let's take another assumption. Let's assume something else. What if that's not how COVID spreads? What if it spreads by the traditional way, fomite transmission? Maybe they just didn't touch any contaminated surfaces. An old-time scientist would have thought of that. You know, a pre-COVID scientist might have said, well, you know, we didn't actually prove this, you know, because we don't really know that that's why. It could have been because contaminated surfaces weren't touched. So we don't know. But that's not how it goes now. It's just called jump to conclusions is your method of science now. And there were other studies, you know, showing that people were transmitting in the asymptomatic period. Several studies of that. Pretty good studies, fairly solidly showing that, except it still wasn't showing how it was transmitted during the asymptomatic period. And then a little while into it, we were told, well, actually, we can do saliva studies. We can check for COVID-19 in saliva. It was a big advancement. We don't have to stick the swab all the way back to the back of your throat. We can get it out of your saliva. And then the University of Nebraska study, inpatients showing, well, it's in the stool, you know, and it's all over every place where these sick people were. So, I mean, that would apply to at home, too. I mean, they certainly would be on all the surfaces at home if they're in the hospital. So still, it doesn't tell us how it's transmitting, because it easily could have been the traditional way, fomite transmission, fecal-oral. Right now in Australia, they're checking water treatment plant effluent for viral RNA. And it makes sense. You know, that way they know where the wastewater is coming from, the general area. They can at least alert the populations there to be a little bit extra careful. Okay, that makes some rational sense. But we're told, oh, it couldn't be, no, transmission's not fecal-oral. Really? How did they decide that? Oh, it's just proclaimed. We just proclaimed it. Yeah, that's what this is. This is science by proclamation. Yeah, it's exhaled breath. That's it. We said so. Forget all that other stuff. All that fecal-oral stuff in the saliva, stool, the University of Nebraska study on all the surfaces everywhere. Hey, forget all that stuff. Because we just said so. So it's science by proclamation. Okay. So the other thing is, then you look at the dates of the winter wave, and you realize, there's no possible way. People people were wearing the same masks earlier and didn't have that, so what was the difference then? Well, here in the United States, it's called winter. And that's why traditionally coronaviruses are winter viruses. Well, why might that be? Because people don't wear their masks right in winter? Or is that why? Or could it possibly be that the mode of transmission is fomite transmission? And they did studies on, the surface viability of COVID. There was a nice study, and it was done at approximately 72 degrees. And it's on the surface, they were saying on the surface, 2-3 days at 72 degrees. Well, there's another biological principle, and that is if you refrigerate something, it's viable longer. Yeah, leave your ham sandwich out on the kitchen counter in August at 90 degrees. It's not going to last long. Stick it in the fridge, you've got a couple days. Okay? Same thing with viruses. Bacteria, viruses, fungi, all these, biological things live longer in the cold. How about that? So what you've done is in winter, if it's on the surfaces, you've prolonged the infectious period. Oh, what would that result in? More infections. So, yeah, and what would that do to social distancing? If I infect this surface here and then get on a plane and 1,000 miles away and a day later you come by, touch it and infect yourself, what good was the 6 feet of social distancing? Didn't work very well. And of course we did have the phenomenon of Christmas shopping. Yeah, that's a real thing. Obviously people are all out Christmas shopping, touching the same things, touching the same door handles, knobs, products, ATM buttons, money. Did anybody ever study how long does COVID live on money? Well, gas pump handles, all kinds of surfaces. Every business with a door that you have to open. The big grocery stores, no, you don't have to open the door to get in, but you want to get some milk out of the cooler, you're going to pull on that handle. And there was one study showing the high prevalence of infections in grocery store workers, which also then, what does that say about the strategy of closing restaurants and bars? And I'm not a restaurant or bar goer, but I do know enough that those establishments are normally constantly cleaning surfaces. That's just part of what they do. So probably they closed some of the safest places to eat and shuffled them off to the grocery store where all the people get infected. Also the nursing homes. Yeah, how did that happen? They never stopped the infections, ever. They just kept going and going and going, and they're testing those people that work there regularly, wearing constant masks. How could that happen? What about grocery delivery? Maybe it was coming in on the surfaces of things. But we didn't think of that because we were so focused on wear a mask, save lives. So bottom line is no, there has never been proof that coronavirus is an exhaled breath. I'm not saying it's not. It might be. Why don't we study it and find out? There sure is a lot of evidence that casts a lot of doubt onto that theory, especially the winter wave when everyone was wearing a mask. You're pushing the envelope of common sense, saying, well, maybe it's leaking out the side or you need 2 or 3 masks. Yeah, that's stretching it. When all the evidence would be more consistent with the predominant transmission of fomite transmission. And that could also say, well, why hasn't Sweden stopped their pandemic? They didn't lock down either. They didn't wear masks, but I'm not sure that they had effective measures in preventing fomite transmission. The bottom line, it's a very infectious virus. It doesn't need too much of it. All you have to do is touch it and then touch your nose or your eyes. So apparently they touch their nose and eyes in Sweden too. So that's why their rates are pretty much the same as ours. Yeah, so to me it looks like masks have no effect. What about lockdowns? Lockdowns obviously would have an effect if they were really strict. Why? Because if you stop people from going out, period, they can't transmit it. I mean, that's a truism. But of course, we always left the grocery stores open, the essential businesses. So the essential businesses were all left to transmit COVID. At any rate, that's about it for now. I think eventually it looks like it's burning itself out on its own. I think the vaccines are going to help. But bottom line, in my opinion, as far as the transmission, they got it wrong, and they didn't really try to get it right. They could have done the studies. They could have been right. I'm not saying they could have been right. They could have been right. I could be totally off. But where's the exhaled breath studies? They just weren't done. And really, it's not too late to do them now. They can still do them. Do the exhaled breath studies, people. Validate your theory. That's what's called science. But that's it. Not a high level of confidence that they're going to do it now. And that's it for now.